The harbour of Telepilos, the stronghold of the Lestrygonians, was a masterpiece of nature's deception. It was a perfect port, a narrow entrance flanked by twin towering cliffs leading into a circular basin where the water lay as still and flat as a sheet of obsidian. No wind ever ruffled its surface, no current pulled at the hulls. Trusting in this tranquility, 11 of Odysseus's captains steered their ships deep into the bowl of the harbour, mooring them side by side. Odysseus, ever the skeptic, stayed his hand. He moored his own black ship outside the cliffs, lashing his cable to a spur of rock at the very edge of the open sea. Odysseus sent 3 scouts inland to find the bread-eaters of the country. They followed a wagon track until they met a girl at a spring, a daughter of the king, Antiphates. She seemed normal enough, if large, and led them to her father's palace. The horror that followed was instantaneous. The queen of the Lestrygonians emerged, a woman vast as a mountain peak, and her husband, Antiphates, did not offer the scouts wine or bread. He snatched the first man up and tore him apart for his midday meal. The other 2 scouts fled, but the king raised a cry that echoed through the cliffs like a war horn. Thousands of Lestrygonians, not mere men, but giants of terrifying stature, rushed to the heights overlooking the crowded harbour. What followed was not a battle, it was a harvest. The giants loosed boulders the size of millstones from the cliffs. The 11 ships trapped in the basin were smashed like eggshells. The sound of splintering timber and the screams of drowning men filled the air. But the giants were not finished. They speared the swimming survivors like fish on a rotisserie and carried them back to the city to be eaten. Odysseus, watching from the mouth of the harbour, saw his entire fleet, hundreds of his loyal companions, wiped out in a matter of minutes. With a desperate stroke of his sword, he hacked through his own mooring cable. "Row!" he shrieked to his crew. "Row for your lives, or follow them to the spit!" His single ship escaped, a lonely speck on the vast sea. Odysseus wept as they rowed, for he had left the harbour of the Lestrygonians not as a king of a fleet, but as a fugitive with a ghost ship. The survivors eventually washed up on the shores of Aea, the home of Circe, a daughter of the sun, Helios. For 2 days the men lay on the sand, paralyzed by grief and exhaustion. On the 3rd day, Odysseus managed to kill a great antlered stag to feed his crew, but he knew they could not stay hidden forever. He divided the remaining 44 men into 2 groups. He led one, the noble Eurylochus led the other. They drew lots, and it fell to Eurylochus to lead 22 men into the thick forest toward a plume of smoke. In a clearing of polished stone, the men found Circe's palace. It was surrounded by lions and mountain wolves, but they did not attack. Instead, they wagged their tails and fawned over the men like domestic dogs, their eyes full of a strange, human sorrow. From inside came the sound of a woman singing in a low, vibrato voice as she wove an indestructible web on a golden loom. When she invited them in, only Eurylochus stayed outside, sensing a trap. Circe sat the men on high thrones and fed them a mixture of barley, cheese, and golden honey stirred into Pramnian wine. But she added a vile drug to the brew, something to make them forget their fatherland entirely. As they ate, she tapped them with her long wand. Instantly, their skin thickened into bristles, their noses flattened into snouts. They grunted and scrambled onto all fours. They had the minds of men trapped in the bodies of swine, and Circe heartlessly tossed them acorns and cornel berries as they wallowed in the filth of her pens. When Eurylochus ran back to the ship, too terrified to speak, Odysseus slung his silver-studded sword and his bow over his shoulder. He went alone. On the path to the palace, he was met by a young man whose beard was just beginning to grow, the god Hermes in disguise. "Where are you going, unlucky man?" Hermes asked. "Into the claws of the enchantress? You will never return unless I help you." Hermes reached into the earth and pulled up a strange plant with a black root and a flower as white as milk. "The gods call it moly," he said. "It is hard for mortal men to dig up, but the gods can do anything. Carry this, and her drugs will have no power over you." Odysseus entered the palace. He drank the drugged wine, and Circe struck him with her wand, commanding, "Go to the sty now, and lie with your friends." But the moly held. Odysseus did not change. Instead, he drew his sword and lunged at her throat. The goddess shrieked, fell to her knees, and clasped his legs. She knew at once who he was, the man of many turns, whom Hermes had prophesied would one day come to her. "Put up your sword," she whispered, her voice shifting from a threat to a lure. "Let us go to my bed and learn to trust one another." Odysseus, ever the bargainer, refused until she swore a great oath of the immortals that she would work no more mischief against him. Only then did he relent. For a full year the Ithacans stayed on Aiaia. Circe restored the crew to human form, making them younger and taller than they had been before, and provided a life of endless meat and sparkling wine. But as the seasons turned, the men began to hunger for home. "Remember Ithaca," they urged Odysseus. "Remember the wife and the son." When Odysseus finally approached Circe to ask for her leave, she gave him a chilling instruction. To get home, he could not simply sail west. He had to sail south, to the very edge of the world, where the sun never shines. He had to descend into the house of Hades to consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias. The transition from the golden sunlight of Aiaia to the clotted mists of the Cimmerian lands felt like a slow descent into a tomb. Odysseus felt the warmth leach from his bones as the north wind, a gift from the goddess Circe, filled their sails, driving them toward the world's end. The crew sat in a heavy, unnatural silence. The sea here did not sparkle, but heaved in oily, leaden swells that sucked at the hull. They reached the limit of the world, where the sun never dares to show its face, and eternal night wraps the shore in a freezing shroud. Perimedes and Eurylochus, usually the bravest of his captains, gripped the gunwales until their knuckles turned white. Following Circe's grim recipe, Odysseus led his men ashore at the place where the fire river Pyriphlegethon and the wailing Cocytus meet the Acheron. They did not find a grand palace, but a barren land of poplars and weeping willows that seemed to shiver without a breeze. With his bronze sword, Odysseus dug a trench a cubit square. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient dust as he poured the libations to the breathless dead. 1. Honey and milk, to entice the spirits with the sweetness of the life they lost. 2. Sweet wine, to remind them of the warmth of the sun. 3. Clear water, dusted with white barley, the staple of the living. Then came the final, terrible step. He sacrificed a ram and a black ewe, turning their heads toward Erebus while he looked away toward the sea. As the dark blood pooled in the trench, the silence of the wasteland was shattered. From the cracks of the earth they came, thousands of shadows, drifting like smoke, shrieking with voices like the rustling of dry leaves or the clicking of bats. My heart turned pale with fear, Odysseus would later recount. Brides, old men, and soldiers still wearing their blood-stained armor swarmed the pit. But I stood my ground, my blade drawn, keeping the blurring ghosts away from the blood until the prophet appeared. Finally, the ghost of the blind Theban Tiresias drifted forward. Unlike the other shades who wandered aimlessly, he retained his mind and his golden staff. He bent his translucent head to drink from the trench, and as the lifeblood touched his lips, his voice found its strength, a resonant, hollow sound that seemed to vibrate in Odysseus's very teeth. "Son of Laertes," Tiresias hissed, his eyes sightless but seeing. "You seek a sweet homecoming, but a god will make it bitter. Poseidon still seethes because you blinded his son, the Cyclops. You may still reach home, but only through great suffering." Tiresias laid out the map of the future with haunting clarity. The island of Thrinacia. They would find the grazing cattle of Helios, the sun god. "If you harm a single beast," Tiresias warned, "I see destruction for your ship and your crew. Even if you escape, you will come home late in a stranger's ship, all your comrades dead." The suitors. He warned that Odysseus would find his halls infested with arrogant men, eating his food and wooing Penelope. He would have to pay them back in blood. The final trek. The most cryptic prophecy of all. After reclaiming his throne, Odysseus would have to take a well-planed oar and walk inland so far that he found a people who had never seen the sea. He would know he had arrived when a traveler asked why he carried a winnowing fan on his shoulder. Only then, by planting the oar and sacrificing to Poseidon, would his debt be paid. Before Odysseus could flee, the crowd of ghosts pressed in. One shadow emerged that made the hero's knees tremble, his mother, Anticlea. He had left her alive when he sailed for Troy 20 years prior. "My son," she lamented, her voice a thin reed in the wind. "It was not sickness that took me, but longing for you, for your cleverness and your kind ways." The sight broke Odysseus. He stepped forward to embrace her, but 3 times his arms passed through her like a dream or a pillar of smoke. "Am I being mocked by Persephone?" he cried out in agony. "No, my child," she replied softly. "This is the law of the dead. The fire consumes our sinews, and the spirit flits away like a shadow." Shaken and hollowed by the truth of what lay ahead, Odysseus hurried his men back to the ship. They fled the shore of the dead, the sound of the wailing ghosts still ringing in their ears long after the sun began to peek over the horizon once more. They were heading back to Circe, but the man who stepped onto the deck was no longer the man who had left Aea. He carried the weight of the underworld in his eyes. The ship returned to Aea only long enough to bury the young Elpenor, who had fallen from Circe's roof in a drunken stupor before their departure, and to receive the goddess's final, harrowing counsel. As the dawn broke, Circe took Odysseus aside, her eyes shimmering with a light that was not entirely kind. "You have seen the dead," she whispered, "but now you must face the living perils of the salt sea. First come the sirens, who sit in a meadow of rotting corpses and sing a song so sweet it melts the marrow in a man's bones. No one who hears it ever reaches home to embrace his wife or children." She handed him a heavy cake of beeswax. "Plug your men's ears. But if you, Odysseus, wish to hear the song, have them bind you upright against the mast. If you beg to be released, they must only pull the ropes tighter." As the wind died down, and the sea became a mirror of polished glass, Odysseus set to work. He sliced the wax with his bronze blade and kneaded it until it softened in the heat of the noon sun. One by one, he sealed the ears of his crew. Then Perimedes and Eurylochus lashed him to the mast with heavy hempen cords. As they neared the flowery island, the song drifted over the water. It was not a scream or a haunting cry, but a melody of such profound beauty that it promised the answer to every secret in the universe. "Come closer, famous Odysseus," they sang, their voices intertwining like silk. "We know all that the Greeks and Trojans suffered. We know all that happens on the fertile earth." Odysseus felt his soul straining to leave his body. The ropes bit into his skin as he thrashed, screaming at his men to let him go, to let him drown in that music. But the crew, deaf to the melody and focused only on the rhythmic dip of their oars, saw his madness and, following his earlier orders, stepped forward to bind him even tighter. Only when the island vanished over the horizon did the madness lift, leaving Odysseus slumped against the timber, shivering in the sudden silence. But there was no time for relief. Ahead, the air grew dark with spray, and the roar of the ocean sounded like 1,000 lions. They had reached the narrow strait where two horrors stood guard. On the left lay Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that gulped down the black seawater 3 times a day and spat it back out in a geyser of foam. To be caught in her maw was certain death for the entire ship. On the right loomed a jagged rock, the lair of Scylla. "She is a creature of nightmare," Circe had warned. 6 heads on serpentine necks, each with 3 rows of fangs. She will take 1 man for every throat she possesses, but better to lose 6 than to lose the whole ship to the whirlpool. Odysseus paced the deck, his armor clanking. He ignored Circe's advice to remain unarmed, grasping 2 long spears as he peered into the mist of the cliffside. He chose to steer closer to Scylla to avoid the certain annihilation of the whirlpool. The ship shuddered as Charybdis began to suck the sea inward, revealing the dark, sandy floor of the ocean deep below. The men paled, their eyes fixed on the churning vortex to their left. It was in that moment of distraction that Scylla struck. With a sound like a whip cracking, 6 heads darted down from the clouds. 6 of Odysseus's best men were plucked from the deck, their legs dangling in the air as they were hauled up the cliff face. "Odysseus!" they shrieked, calling his name for the final time. He watched, helpless, as the monster devoured them at the mouth of her cave. It was, as he later told the Phaeacians, the most piteous sight he had ever seen in all his years of wandering the gray seas. Ghostly and depleted, the remaining crew rowed with a desperation that bordered on collapse. As the sun began to set, the low golden hills of Thrinacia appeared on the horizon. Across the water came a sound that made Odysseus's blood run cold, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. The warnings of Tiresias and Circe echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. "Row past," Odysseus commanded, his voice cracking. "This island is a trap. We must not land." But Eurylochus stood, his face gaunt with exhaustion. "You are made of iron, Odysseus, but we are only men. Our bones ache, and the night is coming. Would you have us perish at sea in the dark? Let us rest one night on the sand, and we will sail at dawn." The rest of the crew muttered their agreement, their eyes hollow. Odysseus looked at their tired faces and felt a terrible chill of foreboding. He knew he could not force them, but he made them swear a blood oath. They would eat only the food Circe had given them, and never lay a hand on the holy cattle of the sun. They stepped onto the beach, unaware that a storm was brewing that would keep them trapped on the island for a month, until their supplies ran out and the hunger began to gnaw. For a full month, the south wind blew without ceasing, a steady, mocking gale that kept the Ithacans pinned to the shores of Thrinacia. As long as Circe's red wine and grain lasted, the men kept their oaths, eyeing the sun god's cattle, magnificent, broad-browed beasts with horns that caught the light like polished gold, with wary respect. But the belly is a relentless master. When the bread was gone, the men turned to hunting for lean birds and catching fish with curved hooks. But it was never enough. Their ribs began to show through their tunics, and their eyes grew wild with the hollow stare of the starving. One afternoon, seeking solace, Odysseus withdrew to a sheltered glade to pray to the gods for a way home. As he knelt, a heavy, unnatural slumber, sent by the Olympians, fell over his eyelids. While the captain slept, Eurylochus gathered the men. His voice was a rasping whisper. "Comrades, all deaths are hateful, but to starve is the most pitiful way to go. Let us drive off the best of these long horns and sacrifice them to the gods. If we reach Ithaca, we will build Helios a temple so grand it will pay for these lives 10 times over. And if the sun god is angry and sinks us, better to die in the salt waves with a full belly than to waste away on a desert island." The men, driven by the gnawing pain in their guts, did not hesitate. They rounded up the finest of the herd, slaughtered them, and roasted the meat on spits. When Odysseus awoke and smelled the savory smoke drifting through the trees, he let out a cry of horror. He knew then that their lives were forfeit. The gods did not wait for the ship to sail to show their displeasure. A terrifying omen struck the camp. The hides of the dead cattle began to crawl across the sand. The meat upon the spits, both raw and roasted, began to bellow and low with the voices of living bulls. For 6 days, the men feasted in defiance of the heavens. On the 7th, the wind finally died down. They launched the ship, desperate to put the cursed island behind them. But they had not even lost sight of land before the sky turned the color of a bruised lung. Helios, the sun god, had already appealed to Zeus. "Father, punish the crew of Odysseus. If they do not pay for my cattle, I will go down to the underworld and shine only for the dead." To keep the sun in the sky, Zeus struck. A massive squall screamed out of the west. A sudden gust snapped the forestays, and the mast toppled backward, crushing the skull of the helmsman. Then came the lightning, a blinding, white-hot bolt that struck the ship dead center. The vessel reeled, filled with the choking smell of sulfur. The men were tossed into the churning surf like seagulls. Odysseus watched as the heads of his loyal companions bobbed briefly in the foam before the black water swallowed them forever. Odysseus alone remained. He managed to lash the mast and the keel together with a strip of ox hide, forming a makeshift raft. For 9 days he drifted, scorched by the sun by day and frozen by the spray by night. He passed the terrifying maw of Charybdis once more, surviving only by clinging to the branches of a wild fig tree like a bat until the whirlpool spat his timbers back up. On the 10th night, the waves washed him ashore on the island of Ogygia. There, far from the world of men and the reach of his enemies, he was found by the nymph Calypso, a goddess of braided hair and haunting beauty. For 7 years, the man who had outwitted the Trojans and survived the Cyclops, found himself defeated by a different kind of adversary, a paradise from which there was no escape. Ogygia was not a place of jagged rocks or monsters, but an island of lush, intoxicating beauty at the very navel of the sea. The goddess Calypso, daughter of Atlas, kept Odysseus in a vaulted cave that was less a dungeon and more a sanctuary. The environment was designed to soothe every human sense. The sense. A great fire of cedar and sandalwood blazed on her hearth, perfuming the entire island. The sounds. Calypso moved to and fro before her loom, singing in a high, melodic voice that seemed to harmonize with the 4 crystal springs bubbling nearby. The sights. Thick vines of purple grapes trailed over the cave's mouth, and meadows of soft parsley and violets bloomed in every direction. Calypso was not a cruel captor. She was a lonely one. She loved Odysseus with a desperate, divine intensity. She fed him ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods, and made him a promise that most mortal men would kill for: immortality and eternal youth. She offered to strip away his grey hairs, heal his scarred heart, and make him a god to rule the island by her side forever. But to Odysseus, a man defined by his struggle and his heritage, a life without home was no life at all. The lack of conflict made the days bleed together into a meaningless golden blur. The most striking image of Odysseus on Ogygia is not that of a warrior, but of a broken man. Every day, once the sun climbed high, he would leave the cave and the goddess's bed to sit on the rocky headlands. He would sit there on the shore, Homer writes, breaking his heart with tears and sighs and sorrows, staring out over the barren sea with wet eyes. He scanned the horizon for a single smudge of smoke from an Ithacan hearth, but he saw only the endless, indifferent blue. He was a prisoner of love and geography, stuck in a place so remote that even the messenger god, Hermes, complained about the immeasurable trek required to reach it. Odysseus might have withered away on those rocks, if not for Athena. Taking advantage of Poseidon's absence, she pleaded his case to Zeus. She argued that it was a travesty for a man so pious and clever to be kept like a pet by a minor goddess. Zeus relented and dispatched Hermes, the wayfinder, to deliver the divine decree. Calypso must let the man go. She was not to provide him a ship or a crew. He had to build his own craft and face the sea alone once more. When Hermes arrived, Calypso flew into a rage, railing against the cruel gods who allowed themselves to take mortal lovers, but forbade goddesses from doing the same. However, no one defies the king of the gods. She eventually sought out Odysseus on his usual rock and told him the news he had waited 7 years to hear. It was time to build. With the decree of Zeus echoing in her ears, Calypso led Odysseus to the edge of the island, where the great trees grew, alder, poplar, and sky-towering pine. She gave him a heavy bronze double axe with a handle of olive wood, and for the first time in 7 years, the lethargy of Ogygia fell away from him. Odysseus was a builder again. Odysseus felled 20 trees in all, stripping their bark and leveling them with a chalk line. He was not merely building a float, he was engineering a vessel capable of surviving the wine-dark sea. The hull. He bored holes through the logs and bolted them together with wooden pegs and joints. The deck. He raised a half-deck with close-set ribs and finished it with long gunnels to keep out the spray. The rigging. He fashioned a mast and a yard arm, then used a great roll of cloth Calypso provided to sew the sails. The protection. To keep the waves from swamping him, he wove a barrier of willow withes along the sides to act as a breakwater. On the 4th day, the work was done. On the 5th, Calypso bathed him, gave him scented clothes, and stocked his raft with a skin of dark wine, a larger one of water, and a sack of grain. As he pushed off from the shore, a warm, gentle wind, sent by the goddess, filled his sails. For 17 days, Odysseus steered by the stars. He kept the Great Bear, the Wain, on his left hand, just as Calypso had instructed, watching the constellations wheel across the velvet sky. On the 18th day, the shadowy mountains of the Phaeacian land, Scheria, appeared on the horizon, looking like a shield flung upon the misty sea. But his luck ran dry. Poseidon, returning from a feast in Ethiopia, looked down from the mountains of Solymi and saw the hero he loathed so close to safety. "Outrageous!" the Earthshaker roared. "The gods have changed their minds while I was away. But I think I can still give this man a bellyful of trouble." Poseidon gathered the clouds and gripped his trident. He stirred the sea into a boiling cauldron and summoned the 4 winds, the north, south, east, and west, to collide at a single point. The sky vanished. Night fell instantly, torn only by the jagged white veins of lightning. A massive wave, terrible in its fury, crashed down on the raft. The steering oar was ripped from Odysseus's hands, and he was flung into the freezing depths. The weight of his divine clothes, the heavy robes Calypso had given him, dragged him down like lead weights toward the dark floor of the ocean. When he finally breached the surface, gasping and spitting brine, his raft was a splintered wreck. He managed to scramble back onto a single floating timber, sitting astride it like a man on a horse. Help came from an unlikely source. Ino, Leucothea, a sea nymph who had once been mortal, rose from the waves like a shearwater. She took pity on the battered hero. "Strip off those heavy clothes," she commanded, perched on his timber. "Leave the raft. It is finished. Wrap this immortal veil around your waist. It will keep you from drowning. But once you reach the shore, cast it back into the sea without looking behind you." Odysseus, ever cynical, hesitated. He waited until a second mountain-sized wave shattered his last log before he stripped naked, tied the shimmering veil beneath his chest, and dove headlong into the chaos. For 2 days and 2 nights, Odysseus drifted, suspended between life and death by the magic of the veil. When he finally neared land, his heart sank. There was no beach, only jagged reefs and sheer cliffs where the surf thundered with enough force to crush his bones. A massive surge swept him toward the rocks. He lunged out and gripped a jagged outcrop, his skin tearing as the backwash tried to suck him back into the deep. Only by the grace of Athena, who put a thought into his mind, did he manage to swim along the coast until he found the mouth of a gentle river. He crawled onto the muddy bank, his flesh swollen with salt water and his body shivering. He cast Ino's veil back into the river, then hollowed out a bed beneath 2 intertwining olive trees, one wild, one planted, and covered himself in a thick blanket of fallen leaves. There, the man of many sorrows finally fell into a death-like sleep, hidden from the world.